Chapter 2. 2 days later, I came upon that which Ada Marsh sought. My Uncle Sylvan's papers were concealed in a place where Ada Marsh had looked first, behind a shelf of curious occult books, but set into a secret recess there, which I happened to open only by clumsy chance. A journal of sorts, and many scraps and sheets of paper covered with tiny script in what I recognized as my uncle's hand. I took them at once to my own room and locked myself in, as if I feared that at this hour, at dead of night, Ada Marsh might come for them. An absurd thing to do, for I not only did not fear her, but actually was drawn to her far more than I would have dreamed I might be when first I met her. Beyond question, the discovery of the papers represented a turning point in my existence. Say that my first 22 years were static on a waiting plane. Say that the early days at my Uncle Sylvan's coast house were a time of suspension between that earlier plane and that which was to come. The turning point came surely with my discovery, and yes, reading, of the papers. But what was I to make of the first paragraph on which I gazed? Subterranean continental shelf, northernmost end at Innsmouth, stretching all the way around to vicinity Singapore. Originating source off Ponape. A suggests R in Pacific, vicinity of Ponape. E holds R near Innsmouth. Majority of writers suggest it in depths. Could R occupy entire continental shelf from Innsmouth to Singapore? That was the first. The second was even more baffling. C, who waits dreaming in R, is all in all and everywhere. He is in R at Innsmouth and at Ponape. He is among the islands and in the depths. How are the deep ones related? And where did Obed and Cyrus make the first contact, Ponape or one of the lesser islands? And how, on land or in the water? But my uncle's papers were not alone in that treasure trove. There were other, even more disturbing, revelations. The letter, for instance, from the Reverend Jabez Lovell Phillips to some unnamed person, dated over a century before, in which he wrote, "On a certain day in August of 1797, Captain Obadiah Marsh, accompanied by his first mate Cyrus Alcott Phillips, reported their ship, the Cory, lost with all hands in the Marquesas. The captain and his first mate arrived in Innsmouth harbour in a rowboat, yet did not seem any the worse for weather or wear, despite having covered a distance of many thousands of miles in a craft deemed well nigh impossible of having carried them so far. Thereafter began in Innsmouth such a series of happenings as were to make the settlement accursed within one generation, for a strange race was born to the Marshes and the Phillipses, a blight was fallen upon their families, which followed after the appearance of women, and how came they there, who were the wives of the captain and his first mate, and loosed upon Innsmouth a spawn of hell that no man has found it possible to put down, and against whom all the appeals to heaven I have made have no avail. What disports in the waters off Innsmouth in the late hours of darkness? Mermaids, say some. Faugh, what idiocy! Mermaids indeed! What, if not the accursed spawn of the Marsh and Phillips tribes? Of this I read no more, being curiously shaken. I turned next to my uncle's journal, and found the last entry. R is as I thought. Next time I shall see C himself, where he lies in his depths, waiting upon the day to come forth once more. But there had been no next time for Uncle Sylvan, only death. There were entries before this one, many of them. Clearly, my uncle wrote of matters beyond my knowledge. He wrote of Cthulhu and Relier, of Hastur and Thoigor, of Shub-Niggurath and Yog-Sothoth, of the Plateau of Leng, of the Sussex Fragments and the Necronomicon, of the Marsh Drift and the Abominable Snowman. But, most often of all, he wrote of R'lyeh and of great Cthulhu, the R and the C of his papers, and of his abiding search for them, for my uncle, as was made plain in his own handwriting, was in search of these places or beings. I could hardly distinguish one from the other in the way he set down his thoughts, for his notes and his journal were written for no other eyes but his own, and he alone understood them, for I had no frame of reference upon which to draw. There was, too, a crude map drawn by some hand before my Uncle Sylvan's, for it was old and badly creased. It fascinated me, though I had no genuine understanding of its real worth. It was a rough map of the world, but not of that world I knew or had learned about in my studies, rather of a world that existed only in the imagination of him who had made the map. For deep in the heart of Asia, for instance, the map-maker had fixed the Plateau Leng, and above this, near what ought to have been Mongolia, Kadath in the cold waste, which was specified as in space-time continua coterminous. And in the sea about the Polynesias, he had indicated the Marsh Drift, which I gathered was a break in the ocean floor. Devil Reef off Innsmouth was indicated too, and so was Ponape. These were recognizable, but the majority of place names on that fabulous map were utterly alien to me. I hid the things I found where I was sure Ada Marsh would not think of looking for them, and I returned, late though the hour was, to the central room, and there I sought out, as if by instinct, unerringly, the shelf behind which the things I had found had been concealed. There were some of the things mentioned in Uncle Sylvan's notes, the Sussex Fragments, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Culte de Gaulle by the Comte Derleth, the Book of Iben, von Juntz's Unersprechlichen Kulten, and many others. But alas, most of them were in Latin or Greek, which I could not read well, however ably I could struggle through French or German. Yet I found enough in these pages to fill me with wonder and terror, with horror and a strangely exhilarating excitement, as if I had realized that my Uncle Sylvan had bequeathed me not only his house and property, but his quest and the lore of eons before the time of man. For I sat reading until the morning sun invaded the room and paled the lamps I'd lit, reading about the great old ones who were first among the universes, and the elder gods who fought and vanquished the rebellious ancient ones, who were great Cthulhu, the water-dweller, Hastur, who reposed at the lake of Hali in the Hyades, Yog-Sothoth, the all-in-one and one-in-all, Ithaquah, the wind-walker, Thoigor, the star-treader, Cthugha, who abides in fire, great Azathoth, all of whom had been vanquished and exiled to outer spaces against the coming of another day in far time yet to come, when they could rise with their followers and once again vanquish the races of mankind and challenge the elder gods. Of their minions, the deep ones of the seas and the watery places on earth, the Dôls, the abominable snowmen of Tibet and the hidden plateau of Leng, the Shantaks who flew from Kadath in the cold waste at the bidding of Windwalker, the Wendigo, cousin of Ithaquah. Of their rivalries, one and yet divided. I read all this and more, damnably more. The collection of newspaper clippings of inexplicable happenings accounted for by my Uncle Sylvan as evidence of the truth in which he believed, and in the pages of these books was more of the curious language I had found woven into the decorations of my uncle's house. Funglui, Mugwalnof, Cthulhu R'lyeh, Wagandigal Fatangen, which was translated, I read in more than one of these accounts, as in his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu lies dreaming. And my uncle's quest was surely nothing more than to find R'lyeh, the sunken subaqueous place of Cthulhu. In the cold light of day, I challenged my own conclusions. Could my Uncle Sylvan have believed in such a panoply of myths? Or was his pursuit merely the quest of a man steeped in idleness? My uncle's library consisted of many books ranging through the world's literature, yet one considerable section of his shelving was given over completely to books on occult subjects, books of strange beliefs, and even stranger facts, inexplicable to science, books on little-known religious cults, and these were supplemented by huge scrapbooks of clippings from newspapers and magazines, reading which filled me at one and the same time with a sense of premonitory dread and a flame of compulsive joy. For in these prosaically reported facts there lay oddly convincing evidence to augment belief in the myth pattern to which my uncle had patently subscribed. After all, the pattern in itself was not new. All religious beliefs, all myth patterns, in no matter what system of culture, are basically familiar. They are predicated upon a struggle between forces of good and forces of evil. This pattern was part 2 of my uncle's mythos. The great old ones and the elder gods, who may, for all I could figure out, have been the same, represented primal good. The ancient ones, primal evil. As in many cultures, the elder gods were not often named, the ancient ones were, and often, for they were still worshipped and served by followers throughout Earth and among the planetary spaces. And they were aligned not only against the elder gods, but also against one another in a ceaseless struggle for ultimate dominion. They were, in brief, representations of elemental forces, and each had his element. Cthulhu of water, Cthugha of fire, Ithaquah of air, Hastur of interplanetary spaces. And others among them belonged to great primal forces, Shub-Niggurath, the messenger of the gods, of fertility, Yog-Sothoth of the time-space continua, Azathoth, in a sense the fountainhead of evil. Was this pattern, after all, not familiar? The elder gods could so easily have become the Christian Trinity, the ancient ones could for most believers have been altered into Sathanas and Beelzebub, Mephistopheles and Azrael, except that they were coexistent, which disturbed me, though I knew that systems of belief constantly overlapped in the history of mankind. More, there was certain evidence to show that the Cthulhu myth pattern had existed not only long before the Christian mythos, but also before that of ancient China and the dawn of mankind, surviving unchanged in remote areas of the earth, among the Chocho people of Tibet and the abominable snowmen of the high plateaus of Asia, and a strange sea-dwelling people known as the Deep Ones, who were amphibian hybrids, bred of ancient matings between humanoids and batrachia, mutant developments of the race of man, surviving with recognizable facets in newer religious symbols, in Quetzalcoatl and others among the gods of Aztec, Mayan, and Inca religions, in the idols of Easter Island, in the ceremonial masks of the Polynesians and the northwest coast Indians, where the tentacle and octopoid shape which were the marks of Cthulhu persisted, so that in a sense it might be said that the Cthulhu mythos was primal. Even putting all this into the realm of theory and speculation, I was left with the tremendous amounts of clippings which my uncle had collected. These prosaic newspaper accounts served perhaps more effectively in giving pause to any doubt I might have had, because all were so palpably repertorial, for none of my uncle's clippings derived from any sensational source. All came straight from news columns or magazines, offering factual material only, like the National Geographic, so that I was left asking myself certain searching questions. What did happen to Johansen and the ship Emma, if not what he himself set forth? Was any other explanation possible? And why did the U.S. government send destroyers and submarines to depth-bomb the ocean about Devil Reef outside the harbor of Innsmouth, and arrest scores of Innsmouth people who were never afterward seen again, and to fire the coastal area, destroying scores of others? Why, if it were not true that strange rites were being observed by Innsmouth people who bore a hellish relationship to certain sea-dwellers seen by night at Devil Reef? and what happened to Wilmarth in the mountain country of Vermont, when he came too close to the truth in his research into the cults of the Ancient Ones, and to certain writers of what purported to be fiction, Lovecraft, Howard, Barlow, and what purported to be science, like Fort, when they came too close to the truth. Dead, all of them, dead or missing, like Wilmarth, dead before their time, most of them while still comparatively young men. My uncle had their books, though only Lovecraft and Fort had been extensively published in book form, and they were opened by me and read with greater perturbation than ever, for the fictions of H.P. Lovecraft had, it seemed to me, the same relation to truth as the facts so inexplicable to science reported by Charles Fort. If fiction, Lovecraft's tales were damnably bound to fact, even dismissing Fort's facts, the fact inherent in the myths of mankind. They were quasi-myths themselves, as was the untimely fate of their author, whose early death had already given rise to a score of legends, from among which prosaic fact was ever more and more difficult to discover. But there was time for me to delve into the secrets of my uncle's books, to read further into his notes. So much was clear. He had belief enough to have begun a search for sunken Relier, the city or the kingdom. One could not be sure which it was, or whether indeed it ringed half the earth from the coast of Massachusetts in the Atlantic to the Polynesian Islands in the Pacific, to which Cthulhu had been banished, dead and yet not dead. Dead Cthulhu lies dreaming, as it read in more than one account, waiting, biding his time to rise and rebel again, to strike once more for dominion against the rule of the elder gods, for a world and universes of his own persuasion. For is it not true that if evil triumphs, then evil becomes the law of life, and it is good that must be fought, the rule of the majority establishing the norm, and other than that being abnormal, or, by the way of mankind, the bad, the abhorrent. My uncle had sought Relier, and he had written disturbingly of how he had done so. He had gone down into the Atlantic steppes, from his home here on the coast, gone down off Devil Reef and beyond, but there was no mention of how he had done so. By diving equipment, bathysphere, of these I had found no evidence whatsoever at the house. It was on these explorations that he had gone during those periods when he had been so long missing from the house on the coast, and yet there had been no mention of any kind of craft either, nor had my uncle left any such thing in his estate. If Relier was the object of my uncle's search, what then was Ada Marsh's? This remained to be seen, and to the end of discovering it, I allowed some of my uncle's least informative notes to lie on the library table on the following day. I managed to watch her when she came upon them, and I was left in no doubt by a reaction that this was the object of her search, the cache I had found. She had known of these papers, but how? I confronted her. Even before I had a chance to speak, she spoke. "You found them!" she cried. "How did you know about them?" "I knew what he was doing." "The search?" She nodded. "You can't believe," I protested. "How can you be so stupid?" she cried angrily. "Did your parents tell you nothing? Your grandfather? How could you have been raised in darkness?" She came close to me, thrust the papers in her hand at me, and demanded, "Let me see the rest of them." I shook my head. "Please, they are of no use to you." "We shall see." "Tell me, then, he had begun the search." "Yes, but I do not know how. There is neither a diver's suit nor a boat." At this she favored me with the glance, which was a challenging mingling of pity and contempt. "You have not even read all he had written. You haven't read the books. Nothing. Do you know what you are standing on?" "This rug?" I asked wonderingly. No, the design, the pattern. It's everywhere. Don't you know why? Because it is the great seal of Relier. So much at least he discovered years ago, and was proud to emblazon it here. You stand on what you seek. Look further and find his ring."